April 29th, 1945, somewhere in the Bavarian Alps. A group of American soldiers from the 44th Infantry Division encountered something unexpected in the mountain forests. Not German troops preparing for a last stand. Not Nazi officials fleeing justice. Instead, they found a single German man on a bicycle, pedalling frantically down a dirt road, calling out in broken English, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." Within hours, American intelligence officers were face to face with one of the most valuable prizes of the entire war. Not gold, not art, not territory, but knowledge. The knowledge that would define the next century of warfare and space exploration. The knowledge that would put human beings on the moon. The knowledge that American military officials had dismissed as impossible just 5 years earlier. This is the story of how German scientists and engineers went from being objects of American ridicule to the most sought-after minds in the world. How the United States launched Operation Paperclip, the secret program that brought over 1,600 German scientists to America, many with direct ties to the Nazi regime, and how the rocket technology that rained terror on London became the foundation for humanity's greatest adventure. But it begins years earlier, with a man most Americans had never heard of. A lonely figure working in the New Mexico desert, ignored by his own government, mocked by the press, funded only by private donors who believed in his impossible dream. Robert Hutchings Goddard had been obsessed with rockets since he was a teenager in 1898, inspired by H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. By 1914, he had received 2 patents, one for a multi-stage rocket, another for a rocket using liquid fuel. Both would prove revolutionary. On March 16, 1926, on his Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, Goddard achieved something that would change human history. The world's first successful liquid-fueled rocket flight. The rocket, which Goddard later called Nell, rose 41 feet in the air during its 2.5-second flight, landing 184 feet away in a cabbage field. It was crude, it was brief. But it was the beginning of the space age. Just as the Wright brothers' first powered flight at Kitty Hawk had ushered in the age of aviation, Goddard's liquid-fueled rocket opened the door to space exploration. But America didn't see it that way. In 1919, the Smithsonian Institution published Goddard's paper, A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. In it, he outlined his mathematical theories of rocket propulsion and suggested the possibility of sending a rocket to the moon. The press response was brutal. On January 13, 1920, the New York Times published an editorial that would become infamous. It mocked Goddard, suggesting that a professor at a distinguished institution should have the basic knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. The editorial claimed that rockets couldn't work in the vacuum of space because they needed air to push against. Goddard was humiliated. The ridicule drove him deeper into isolation. He became secretive about his work, paranoid that others would steal his ideas or that foreign governments might use his discoveries for military purposes. He worked with only a small team of mechanics and machinists, refusing to collaborate with other scientists. The Guggenheim Foundation became his primary source of funding after aviator Charles Lindbergh took an interest in his work. From 1930 to 1941, Goddard conducted rocket tests at a facility in Roswell, New Mexico. He launched 34 rockets during this period, achieving altitudes as high as 1.6 miles and speeds approaching 550 miles per hour. He developed gyroscopic control systems, vane steering in the rocket exhaust, gimbal steering, power-driven fuel pumps, and countless other innovations. Every single one of these would later appear in the German V2 rocket. But in America, Goddard's work was largely unknown, underfunded, and unappreciated. When World War II began, Goddard offered his services to the military. The Navy gave him a small contract to develop jet-assisted takeoff systems. That was it. No one in the US government saw the strategic potential of long-range rockets. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a very different story was unfolding. In Germany, rocket research wasn't the obsession of a lone inventor. It was a national priority, backed by the full weight of the German military machine. Werner von Braun was born into Prussian aristocracy on March 23, 1912. As a teenager, he read Hermann Oberth's book, The Rocket into Interplanetary Spaces, and became consumed by the dream of space travel. At 17, he joined the German Society for Space Travel, working with amateur rocket enthusiasts in Berlin. In 1932, the German army took notice. They were looking for weapons technologies that could circumvent the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had limited conventional artillery and banned many types of weapons, but it said nothing about rockets. Army officers arranged for von Braun to transfer to the University of Berlin to complete a secret physics dissertation on liquid propellant rocketry. Just as he began his work, Adolf Hitler came to power. Von Braun, raised in a conservative nationalist household, saw an opportunity. The Nazis were willing to fund his rocket research on a scale beyond anything available elsewhere. In April 1936, the German Aviation Ministry paid 750,000 Reichsmarks for the entire northern peninsula of Usedom Island in the Baltic Sea. By mid-1938, the Army Research Centre at Peenemünde was nearly complete. It was one of the most advanced research facilities in the world. Walter Dornberger led the military side of the program. Von Braun, just 25 years old, became the technical director. They had 9 major departments, hundreds of scientists and engineers, unlimited funding. Their goal was to develop the A4 rocket, which would later be renamed the V2, the Vengeance weapon. By late 1941, the Peenemünde team possessed all the essential technologies: large liquid fuel rocket engines, supersonic aerodynamics, gyroscopic guidance, rudders for jet control, technologies that Goddard had pioneered in America, working alone with a handful of assistants and minimal funding. Technologies that the German team, with massive resources and institutional support, had developed to an unprecedented level. On October 3, 1942, they achieved what von Braun would later call one of the most far-reaching technical breakthroughs of the 20th century. The A4 rocket launched successfully from Peenemünde. It travelled 118 miles. It reached an altitude of 50 miles. It became the first man-made object to reach the edge of space. The V2 was a monster, 14 metres long, weighing nearly 13,000 kilograms at launch. It could carry a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles. It travelled at speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. Once launched, it was impossible to intercept or defend against. It arrived without warning, travelling faster than sound itself. By the time you heard it, if you heard it at all, it had already hit. Adolf Hitler, initially sceptical of the rocket program, became convinced it was the wonder weapon that could turn the tide of war. On September 8, 1944, the first V2 was fired at London. Over the next 6 months, more than 3,000 V2 rockets were launched at Allied targets. Most hit London, Antwerp, and other cities. They killed approximately 5,000 Allied civilians and soldiers. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't bombs dropped from aircraft that could be shot down. These were ballistic missiles that arrived from space itself, unstoppable, terrifying, and random. British intelligence and American military observers were stunned. This wasn't just an incremental advance in weapons technology. This was something entirely new. A weapon that travelled to the edge of space before falling back to Earth at supersonic speeds. A weapon that required extraordinary precision in guidance and control. A weapon that demonstrated engineering capabilities far beyond what the Allies had imagined possible. In Washington, American military planners began asking uncomfortable questions. How had Germany achieved this? Why didn't America have anything comparable? What else were the Germans developing? The answers were troubling. While Robert Goddard had been working in isolation in New Mexico, essentially ignored by the American government, Germany had invested massive resources into rocket development. While American officials dismissed rockets as impractical artillery shells, German engineers were creating the foundation for the space age. While American scientists focused on incremental improvements to existing weapons, German scientists were inventing entirely new categories of warfare. The gap was not just technological, it was philosophical. Germany had understood something that America had not, that the nation controlling advanced rocket technology would control the future of warfare, of aviation, of space itself. By early 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, a frantic race began, not just to defeat Germany militarily, but to capture Germany's scientific and technical assets before the other side got them. The Soviets wanted German rocket scientists. The British wanted German rocket scientists, the French wanted German rocket scientists, and the Americans, who had spent the war dismissing rocket technology as impractical, suddenly wanted German rocket scientists more than anything else. In April 1945, Major Robert Staver of the US Army Ordnance was sent to Germany as part of the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. His mission was to find and secure German rocket technology before the Soviets arrived. Initially he thought he had plenty of time, but politics intervened. Negotiations between American, British and Soviet leaders led to an agreement that US troops would withdraw from large sections of central Germany. These areas would be turned over to Soviet control. The problem was simple. These areas contained the primary German rocket facilities, the underground V2 production plant at Nordhausen, the testing grounds, the documentation, the scientists. American teams suddenly had just weeks to find and secure everything before handing the territory to the Soviets. What followed was one of the most frantic and consequential treasure hunts in history. American soldiers and intelligence officers raced across Germany, searching for rocket parts, documents and personnel. They found trainloads of missiles. They found warehouses full of components. They found filing cabinets stuffed with technical drawings and test data. They found manufacturing facilities still intact, and they found something more valuable than all of it combined. They found the scientists who had built it all. Werner von Braun and his team had seen this coming. As the Nazi regime collapsed in spring 1945, they were terrified of falling into Soviet hands. Stories of what the Red Army did to German prisoners haunted them. Von Braun was also acutely aware that Hitler had ordered SS troops to kill all technical personnel associated with rocket development, to prevent their knowledge from falling to the enemy. So, von Braun made a calculated decision. He commandeered a train, evacuated his entire team from Peenemünde, and fled to the Bavarian Alps. He hid 14 tons of documents in an abandoned mine in the Harz Mountains, disobeying Hitler's direct orders to destroy them. Then he waited for the Americans to arrive. When Magnus von Braun encountered that American soldier on his bicycle, it wasn't random chance. It was a carefully orchestrated surrender to the side his brother believed represented the future. Within days, Werner von Braun was in American custody. So were over 100 of his key scientists and engineers. The Americans also captured something equally valuable. Over 300 rail cars full of V2 engines, fuselages, propellant tanks, gyroscopes and equipment. Enough to build approximately 80 complete missiles. In addition, they seized thousands of pages of technical documentation, manufacturing procedures, test data, design specifications, concept studies for future developments. The haul was staggering. American officials who examined the materials were shocked by what they found. The Germans weren't just ahead in rocket technology, they were decades ahead. They had developed guidance systems that American engineers had never conceived. They had mastered supersonic aerodynamics that American scientists were still trying to understand. They had created manufacturing processes that American industry couldn't replicate. They had been researching intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking targets 3,500 miles away. Plans for missiles that could reach the United States itself. This wasn't just advanced engineering. This was technology that redefined what was possible, and the Americans nearly lost all of it. The Soviets were equally determined to capture German rocket technology. As Soviet troops advanced through Germany, they seized the Peenemünde facilities. They captured the underground production plant at Nordhausen. They found thousands of German technicians and workers, but they missed the prize. The Americans had gotten there first. They had taken von Braun and his core team. They had shipped the V2 parts to the United States. They had secured the most valuable documents. The Soviets were left with factories and lower-level personnel. In October 1946, in Operation Paperclip, the Soviets forcibly relocated hundreds of German rocket specialists to the Soviet Union. But they didn't have von Braun. They didn't have the complete documentation. They didn't have the core team that had actually designed and built the V2. The Americans had won the race. But what to do with their prize was another question entirely. On July 20th, 1945, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff officially established Operation Overcast. The initial stated objective was to bring German scientists to America for 6 months to a year to help in the war against Japan. But Japan surrendered in August 1945, and the program continued. It was soon renamed Operation Paperclip, after the paperclips that were attached to the files of German scientists selected for immigration. The name was mundane. The implications were anything but. President Harry Truman had explicitly forbidden the recruitment of any Nazi Party members or active Nazi supporters. But officials within the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency and the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA, had other ideas. They believed the German scientists were too valuable to pass up because of political affiliations. So they simply whitewashed the records. They eliminated or altered evidence of Nazi Party membership. They downplayed or erased connections to war crimes. They rewrote backgrounds to make the scientists appear politically innocuous. Werner von Braun's file was sanitized. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937. He had held rank in the SS. He had been directly involved in the V2 program, which used slave labor from concentration camps. Thousands of prisoners had died in the underground production facilities, worked to death in brutal conditions. More people died building the V2 than were killed by the V2 as a weapon. But none of this appeared in von Braun's cleaned-up file presented to immigration authorities. He was described as a talented scientist focused on his research, with no significant Nazi connections. It was a lie, but it was a lie that American officials decided was acceptable in service of national security. In September 1945, the first group of 7 German rocket scientists arrived in the United States. Von Braun, Erich Neubert, Theodor Poppel, August Schulze, Eberhard Ries, Wilhelm Jungert, and Walter Schwiedetzky. They were designated as War Department special employees and sent to Fort Strong in Boston Harbor, then to Fort Bliss, Texas. Over the next several years, Operation Paperclip would bring more than 600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America. They worked on guided missiles, supersonic aerodynamics, rocket and jet engines, aerospace medicine, submarine technology, and countless other fields. The program was valued at approximately $10 billion in patents and industrial processes. But the arrival of these Germans, particularly von Braun's rocket team, came with controversy from the start. On October 1, 1945, a War Department press release announced that certain outstanding German scientists were being brought to America to ensure the nation took full advantage of developments vital to national security. The backlash was immediate. Rabbi Stephen Wise, head of the American Jewish Congress, complained that more was being done to help pro-Nazi scientists than the victims of Hitler still languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe. Albert Einstein, himself a refugee from Nazi persecution, wrote to President Truman calling von Braun and his colleagues potentially dangerous. Critics argued that America was compromising its moral authority by harboring men who had built weapons of terror for a genocidal regime. But the government had made its calculation. In the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union, technological superiority mattered more than moral purity, especially when it came to rockets. Von Braun and his team initially worked at Fort Bliss and the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. The living conditions were basic. The desert was harsh and unfamiliar. The Germans found it difficult to adjust to their new surroundings, but they got to work. On January 16, 1946, the first V2 test launch took place at White Sands. It was the first of dozens of V2 flights conducted by the American-German team. The launches weren't perfect. One V2 went off course and crashed south of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, creating a minor international incident. But they provided invaluable data and training. American engineers and scientists learned firsthand how the V2 worked. They saw the guidance systems operate. They observed the engine performance. They studied the control mechanisms. They began to understand what the Germans had achieved. And they realized something profound. The Germans hadn't just built a better weapon. They had developed an entirely new approach to engineering, an approach based on systems integration, careful testing, and methodical problem-solving, an approach that would become the foundation of the American space program. In 1950, von Braun's team was moved to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. This became the heart of the Army's ballistic missile program. Von Braun was tasked with developing military rockets, particularly those capable of carrying nuclear warheads. The Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V2, became operational in 1958. But von Braun's ambitions went far beyond military applications. He began appearing in popular magazines. He went on television. He wrote books about space exploration. He collaborated with Walt Disney on television programs about the future of space travel. He cultivated an image as a visionary dreamer whose ultimate goal had always been peaceful space exploration, not weapons of war. It was a carefully constructed narrative. one that downplayed his Nazi past and emphasized his contributions to American science. And for many Americans eager for heroes in the space age, it worked. Then came October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. The news shocked America. If the Soviets could put a satellite into space, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere in the world. The space race had begun, and America was losing. Suddenly, von Braun went from interesting curiosity to national asset. In January 1958, von Braun's team, working with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite. It was a direct response to Sputnik. It demonstrated that America could compete in space. It vindicated von Braun's vision, and it proved that Operation Paperclip, for all its moral compromises, had strategic value. In 1960, von Braun's division was transferred from the Army to a newly created civilian space agency, NASA. Von Braun became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. His mission was to develop the rockets that would take America to the moon. The Saturn rocket program became his masterpiece. The Saturn I, Saturn IB, and finally the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall. It weighed 6.5 million pounds fully fueled. It produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. It could launch 310,000 pounds to low Earth orbit or send 107,000 pounds to the moon. It was an engineering marvel, incorporating lessons learned from the V2, refined through decades of American research, and scaled up to dimensions that would have been unimaginable in 1945. On July 16, 1969, a Saturn V lifted off from Cape Kennedy carrying Apollo 11. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. Wernher von Braun watched from mission control as his rocket achieved his lifelong dream. The man who had built weapons for Hitler had put Americans on the moon. It was the ultimate vindication, the ultimate redemption, the ultimate demonstration that Operation Paperclip had been worth it. But was it really that simple? The moral questions surrounding Operation Paperclip have never gone away. In 1984, Arthur Rudolph, one of von Braun's closest associates and a key figure in the Saturn V program, voluntarily returned to Germany rather than face a denaturalization hearing over his involvement in Nazi war crimes. Rudolph had been the production manager at the Mittelwerk facility, the underground factory where V2 rockets were built by slave labor. Prisoners from the Dora concentration camp worked in horrific conditions. No sunlight, minimal food, brutal treatment. Thousands died. Rudolph had managed this operation. The revelation sparked a re-evaluation of Operation Paperclip and the men it had brought to America. Journalists and historians began digging into the sanitized files. They found evidence that had been deliberately hidden or destroyed. They discovered that many of the German scientists had been far more complicit in Nazi atrocities than their official records indicated. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, had been involved in Nazi human experimentation. Kurt Debus, the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center, had been a member of the SS and the Nazi Party. The list went on. These weren't just men who had worked for the Nazi government out of necessity. They were men who had actively participated in the regime and benefited from its crimes. The US government had known this. They had chosen to hide it, in the name of national security, in the service of technological advancement, in the context of Cold War competition. The question remains, was it worth it? The pragmatic answer is yes. Operation Paperclip accelerated American missile and rocket development by at least a decade. It provided the foundation for intercontinental ballistic missiles that became the backbone of nuclear deterrence. It enabled the space program that put Americans on the moon, and continues to this day. It gave America technological superiority in the early Cold War that may have prevented a hot war. Without Operation Paperclip, without von Braun and his team, the American space program would have developed very differently, more slowly, less successfully. Perhaps not at all, at least not in time to compete with the Soviets. From a purely strategic perspective, Operation Paperclip was one of the most successful intelligence operations in American history. But there's another answer, one that asks whether the ends truly justified the means, whether technological advancement excuses collaboration with genocidal regimes, Whether scientific genius absolves moral culpability, these questions don't have easy answers. Robert Goddard died on August 10, 1945, just days after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He died of throat cancer, never knowing that his work would lead to the moon landing. When German rocket scientists in American custody were asked about their technology, many expressed surprise. Why didn't American officials ask Dr. Goddard, they asked. He pioneered most of what we built. The irony was devastating. The American scientist who had laid the groundwork for modern rocketry had been ignored, underfunded, and mocked by his own country. Meanwhile, German scientists who had studied his work, built upon his ideas and used them to create weapons of terror, were being recruited, protected, and celebrated. Werner von Braun himself later acknowledged the debt to Goddard. In 1963, he said Goddard's rockets may have been rather crude by present-day standards, but they blazed the trail and incorporated many features used in our most modern rockets and space vehicles. He even allegedly asked American officials, "Don't you know about your own rocket pioneer? Dr. Goddard was ahead of us all." The New York Times, which had mocked Goddard in 1920, finally issued a correction on July 17, 1969, the day after Apollo 11 launched. The brief statement acknowledged that further investigation and experimentation had confirmed Isaac Newton's findings from the 17th century, and that rockets could indeed function in a vacuum. It took 49 years for the newspaper to admit it had been wrong. By then, Goddard was long dead, and his place in history secure, though his country had done everything possible to ensure he never received recognition in his lifetime. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is complex, contradictory, and impossible to summarize neatly. On one hand, it represented American pragmatism and strategic thinking at its best, recognizing that the knowledge and expertise of German scientists were too valuable to waste or allow enemies to capture, making the difficult choice to prioritize national security over moral purity, achieving technological breakthroughs that changed the course of history. On the other hand, it represented a moral compromise that undermined the very values America claimed to be defending, shielding war criminals from justice, lying to the American public and to immigration authorities, allowing men complicit in atrocities to build respected careers and receive honors. The Germans who came to America through Operation Paperclip contributed to countless advances. Beyond rockets, they worked on jet aircraft, submarine technology, medical research, chemical processes, and much more. Many became American citizens, raised families here, and saw themselves as loyal Americans. But they carried their past with them, whether acknowledged or not. The program revealed something about America's relationship with science and technology, a belief that technical knowledge exists separate from moral context, that a rocket scientist is just a rocket scientist, regardless of what rockets he built or for whom, that genius excuses everything. This belief continues to shape how we think about science, technology, and progress. Von Braun died in 1977, having received the National Medal of Science and countless other honors. He was celebrated as a hero of the space age. His Nazi past was known but rarely discussed in mainstream coverage. Only after his death, when documents were declassified and investigative journalists dug deeper, did the full scope of his involvement with the Nazi regime become widely known. Today, von Braun's legacy remains contested. To some, he's the father of space exploration, the visionary who made humanity's greatest adventure possible. To others, he's a war criminal who escaped justice and manipulated his image to become an American hero. Both narratives are true. The question is which we choose to emphasize. What's undeniable is that Operation Paperclip changed the world. The rocket technology developed by German scientists in Nazi Germany, brought to America through a program that deliberately concealed their pasts, became the foundation for the space age. The same technology that rained terror on London lifted astronauts to the moon. The same minds that designed weapons of mass destruction designed vehicles of exploration and discovery. It's a reminder that technology is neutral, that the same knowledge can be used to destroy or to discover, that human progress often comes with moral costs, that history is never as simple as we'd like it to be. The German scientists laughed at American rocket technology in 1940. With some justification, America had done little to develop rocket science, had ignored its own pioneer, had dismissed the potential of these weapons. But by 1945, that laughter had turned to desperation. The scientists who had mocked American capabilities were begging to surrender to American forces. Within 15 years, these same scientists were working for America, building American rockets, launching American satellites, advancing American strategic interests. By 1969, they had put Americans on the moon. The transformation was complete. The rocket program that began as Nazi Germany's vengeance weapon had become America's triumph. The scientists who had served Hitler now served democracy, or so the official narrative claimed. The reality was messier, more complicated, more troubling. Operation Paperclip worked because America was willing to make a deal with the devil, or at least with the devil's engineers. The program succeeded because American officials decided that national security outweighed moral principles, that winning the Cold War mattered more than punishing Nazi collaborators, that getting to the moon justified protecting men who had used slave labor. These were conscious choices made by real people, with full knowledge of what they were doing. The consequences of those choices are still with us. The rockets that descend from von Braun's designs still launch American satellites. The engineering approaches developed at Peenemünde still influence aerospace design. The organizational methods refined in Huntsville still structure how NASA operates. The legacy of Operation Paperclip isn't just historical. It's alive in every rocket launch, every space mission, every satellite orbiting overhead. And that legacy is fundamentally ambiguous. Is it a story of American pragmatism and scientific achievement, or is it a story of moral compromise and convenient amnesia? Is von Braun a hero or a villain? Is Operation Paperclip a triumph or a tragedy? The answer is yes, to all of it. Because history isn't a morality play with clear heroes and villains. It's a complicated mess where good people do bad things for understandable reasons, where brilliant minds serve terrible causes, where progress comes at costs we'd rather not acknowledge. Operation Paperclip gave America the technology to win the space race. It also gave America a burden of moral compromise that it has never fully addressed. The German scientists stopped laughing at American rocket technology when they realized America had something Germany never did: the resources, the industrial capacity, and most importantly, the future. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided. America was ascendant, powerful, positioned to dominate the post-war world. The scientists made a calculated choice: work for the winners, build for the future, leave the past behind. And America let them. Because America wanted what they knew more than it wanted justice for what they'd done. That exchange, that bargain, that compromise put humans on the moon. Whether it was worth it remains an open question. The question of whether it was worth it becomes even more complex when we examine what actually happened after Operation Paperclip brought these scientists to American soil. Because the program didn't just transfer knowledge, it transferred an entire culture of engineering, a philosophy of research, and a network of relationships that would shape American science for generations. At Fort Bliss in 1945, the initial group of German scientists found themselves in a bizarre limbo. They were not prisoners, but they weren't exactly free either. They were valuable assets, treated with a strange mixture of respect and suspicion. American officers who had fought against Nazi Germany now found themselves working alongside men who had built Hitler's terror weapons. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. Major James Hamill, assigned to oversee the German team at Fort Bliss, later recalled the surreal nature of those early days. Here were these men, some of whom had held SS rank, eating in the same mess hall as American GIs who had liberated concentration camps. Nobody quite knew how to process it. The official line was that these were scientists, not soldiers, that they had been forced to work for the Nazis, that they were grateful to be in America now. But everyone knew it was more complicated than that. The Germans themselves navigated this strange new world with varying degrees of success. Von Braun, always the politician, immediately began cultivating relationships with American military officials and the press. He was charming, articulate, and presented himself as the embodiment of innocent scientific curiosity. He would speak passionately about space exploration, about humanity's destiny among the stars, about the purely peaceful applications of rocket technology. He never mentioned the V2 attacks on London. He never discussed the slave labour at Mittelwerk. When asked about his Nazi Party membership, he portrayed it as a requirement for his research, something he had to do to continue his work, a necessary accommodation to an unfortunate political situation. Other German scientists were less skilled at managing their image. Some openly expressed nostalgia for the Third Reich. Others made statements that shocked their American handlers about racial superiority or the righteousness of Germany's cause. These incidents were quickly suppressed, kept out of official records, buried in classified files that wouldn't be opened for decades. Meanwhile, the work continued. The V-2 launches at White Sands provided the foundation for everything that followed. Each launch generated data, altitude measurements, velocity calculations, guidance system performance, structural stress analysis. The Germans taught American engineers not just how to launch rockets, but how to think about rockets as complete systems. This was perhaps their greatest contribution. American engineering up to that point had been largely empirical. Build something, test it, fix what breaks, repeat. The German approach was different. It was systematic, theoretical. They would calculate expected performance before building anything. They would model stress points mathematically. They would design redundancy into critical systems. They would document everything meticulously. This engineering discipline, born from German technical education and refined at Peenemünde, revolutionized how America approached complex technical problems. The impact extended far beyond rockets. German scientists brought through Operation Paperclip worked on the Bell X-1, the first aircraft to break the sound barrier. They contributed to jet engine development, helping America compete with British advances in that field. They worked on guidance systems that would evolve into the first cruise missiles. They studied high-altitude medicine, learning how to keep pilots alive in the thin air of the stratosphere. Every field they touched was transformed by their presence. But the most significant impact came in organizational structure. Von Braun didn't just bring rocket designs to America, he brought the Peenemünde model of research organization, large teams of specialists working in coordinated divisions, careful documentation of all work, regular design reviews, systematic testing protocols, formal project management. This approach would become the template for NASA, for American aerospace companies, for research laboratories across the country. The way America organized scientific research in the second half of the 20th century was profoundly influenced by methods developed in Nazi Germany. By the early 1950s, it was becoming clear that rockets were not just weapons but strategic assets that would define global power. The development of the hydrogen bomb in 1952 created an urgent need for delivery systems. Nuclear weapons were useless if you couldn't deliver them to enemy territory. Long-range bombers were one solution, but they were vulnerable to air defenses. Intercontinental ballistic missiles represented the ultimate delivery system. Impossible to intercept, traveling through space itself, capable of reaching any point on Earth within minutes of launch. The Army, Navy, and Air Force all wanted their own missile programs. Von Braun's team at Redstone Arsenal worked on Army missiles. The Air Force had its own programs at various bases. The Navy developed submarine-launched missiles. This created competition for resources and talent, but it also created redundancy that would prove valuable. If one program failed, others could continue. Von Braun's Redstone missile, first tested in 1953, was essentially an improved V-2. It used the same basic design philosophy, but incorporated American innovations in guidance and control. It was more reliable, more accurate, and more powerful than its German predecessor. It could carry a nuclear warhead 200 miles. It was America's first operational ballistic missile. But even as the Redstone program succeeded, von Braun was thinking bigger. He began proposing designs for much larger rockets, missiles that could reach intercontinental ranges, launch vehicles that could put satellites into orbit, rockets that could send humans into space. His ambitions were unlimited, constrained only by funding and political support. Then Sputnik changed everything. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching the first artificial satellite into orbit. Sputnik was small, just 184 pounds, and it did nothing but transmit radio signals. But its implications were enormous. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere in the world. The entire American homeland was suddenly vulnerable. The American response bordered on panic. President Eisenhower tried to downplay the significance, but the public was terrified. Newspapers ran hysterical headlines about Soviet technological superiority. Politicians demanded to know how America had fallen behind. The space race had begun, and America was losing. In November 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2. carrying a dog named Laika into orbit. The spacecraft weighed over 1,300 pounds, demonstrating that Soviet rockets were far more powerful than anything America possessed. The message was clear. The Soviets were ahead, dramatically ahead. The American satellite program was a mess. Project Vanguard, run by the Naval Research Laboratory, was supposed to launch America's first satellite. On December 6, 1957, with the world watching and television cameras rolling, the Vanguard rocket rose a few feet off the launch pad, toppled over and exploded in a massive fireball. The satellite, thrown clear of the explosion, lay on the ground, transmitting its signal mockingly. The press had a field day. They called it Flopnik, Kaputnik, Stayputnik. American humiliation was complete. In desperation, the army turned to von Braun. Could his team launch a satellite? Von Braun assured them he could. He'd been ready for months, he said, just waiting for permission. The Jupiter C rocket, derived from the Redstone, could easily reach orbit if modified properly. Give him 90 days. Von Braun and his team worked around the clock. They modified the Jupiter C, adding upper stages, refining the guidance system, preparing the Explorer 1 satellite built by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. On January 31, 1958, just 84 days after Vanguard's spectacular failure, von Braun's rocket roared into the night sky from Cape Canaveral. Explorer 1 reached orbit. America was finally in space. The success made von Braun a national hero overnight. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He was profiled in Life, in Look, in every major publication. Suddenly his Nazi past didn't matter, or rather it was rewritten. He became the brilliant scientist who had been trapped in Nazi Germany, who had always dreamed of peaceful space exploration, who had come to America seeking freedom and found the opportunity to achieve his lifelong dreams. It was a carefully constructed myth, but America desperately needed heroes in the space race, and von Braun played the role brilliantly. The creation of NASA in 1958 represented the culmination of everything Operation Paperclip had set in motion. President Eisenhower decided that space exploration should be a civilian endeavor, not a military one. NASA would take over from the military services, would coordinate all American space efforts, would compete directly with the Soviet space program, and at the heart of NASA would be von Braun's team from Huntsville. The transfer of von Braun's Army Division to NASA in 1960 brought over 4,000 civil service employees and $100 million in buildings and equipment. Von Braun became director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, responsible for developing the launch vehicles that would take America to space. It was the position he had been working toward his entire life, from Peenemünde to Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal to NASA, from Hitler's engineer to America's space pioneer. The Soviet Union continued to dominate the early space race. On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting the Earth once in his Vostok spacecraft. Once again, America had been beaten. The Soviet achievement was stunning, demonstrating capabilities America couldn't match. President Kennedy felt tremendous pressure to respond. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and announced an audacious goal. America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was an extraordinary commitment, made at a time when America had barely 15 minutes of manned spaceflight experience. Alan Shepard had made a suborbital flight just 3 weeks earlier. America didn't have rockets powerful enough to reach the moon, didn't have spacecraft capable of making the journey, didn't have the knowledge or experience to accomplish what Kennedy was proposing. But Kennedy understood that the space race was about more than science. It was about demonstrating American power, American capability, American superiority in the Cold War struggle, and he was willing to commit unlimited resources to win. Von Braun now had everything he needed: unlimited funding, political support at the highest levels, a clear mission, and the chance to achieve what he had dreamed about since childhood. Getting humans to the moon. The Saturn program became his obsession. The Saturn I was a test vehicle, proving the basic concepts. The Saturn IB would launch Apollo spacecraft into Earth orbit for testing. But the real achievement would be the Saturn V, the moon rocket. The Saturn V was audacious in scale. Its first stage, the SIC, was 138 feet tall and 33 feet in diameter. It contained 5 F1 engines, each producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust. Together they generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust, more than all the rockets launched in human history up to that point combined. The fuel consumption was staggering. The first stage burned 4.5 million pounds of liquid oxygen and kerosene in just 2.5 minutes. That's 15 tons of propellant every second. The second stage, the S-2, used 5 J2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Liquid hydrogen was incredibly difficult to work with. It boiled at minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit, just 37 degrees above absolute zero. Containing it, pumping it, burning it in controlled fashion, all presented enormous technical challenges. The third stage, the SIVB, used a single J2 engine that would restart in space to push the Apollo spacecraft out of Earth orbit toward the Moon. Every aspect of the Saturn V pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The engines alone were marvels of engineering. The F1 engine developed for the first stage was the most powerful single-chamber rocket engine ever built. Each, F1 produced more thrust than all 3 Space Shuttle main engines combined. The turbopumps that fed propellant to the combustion chamber operated at pressures exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch and spun at 5,500 revolutions per minute. The fuel pump alone produced 55,000 horsepower, equivalent to 300 sports car engines. The guidance system had to navigate with extraordinary precision across 250,000 miles of space. The spacecraft had to separate on schedule, fire engines at exact moments, orient itself correctly, all with computer systems that had less processing power than a modern cell phone. The margin for error was minimal. A mistake of a fraction of a degree in trajectory could send the spacecraft hurtling off into space, forever lost. Too much or too little velocity at any critical point meant mission failure. Von Braun's management approach was critical to success. He insisted on ground testing everything multiple times before flight. Every engine was fired on test stands. Every system was checked and rechecked. Every component had backups. This philosophy came directly from Peenemünde, where thorough testing had been essential to success. It drove NASA's schedule and budget planners crazy because it was expensive and time-consuming, but it worked. The Saturn V would eventually launch 13 times, and every launch would be successful. An extraordinary achievement for such a complex system. But the path to that success was not smooth. On January 27, 1967, disaster struck. During a routine test of Apollo 1 on the launch pad, a fire broke out in the pure oxygen atmosphere of the command module. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee died within seconds, unable to escape the sealed capsule. Their deaths shocked the nation and nearly derailed the Apollo program. The investigation revealed serious problems with spacecraft design and quality control. The pure oxygen atmosphere created a massive fire hazard. The hatch design made rapid egress impossible. Flammable materials had been used throughout the cabin. Wiring was poorly installed. The spacecraft was a death trap. NASA underwent a complete reorganization. Spacecraft were redesigned with fire safety in mind. Quality control procedures were overhauled. The entire program was delayed by more than a year. Von Braun used the delay to conduct more tests of the Saturn V. The first unmanned launch, Apollo 4, took place on November 9, 1967. The massive rocket lifted off from Cape Kennedy with a roar that rattled windows for miles around. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, reporting from a viewing stand 3.5 miles away, felt the shockwave hit. The building shook violently. Ceiling tiles fell. Cronkite struggled to maintain his composure as his microphone stand vibrated, shouting over the noise. "The power's unbelievable," he exclaimed. "The building's shaking." His glasses were falling off his face from the vibrations. 3.5 miles away from a rocket launch, and the sheer acoustic power was overwhelming. That image, of America's most trusted newsman shaken by the raw power of the Saturn V, became iconic. The rocket performed flawlessly. All stages fired on time. The spacecraft reached orbit, then fired again to push to a high apogee, testing the heat shield at re-entry velocities approaching those of lunar return. Everything worked. Von Braun's rocket was ready. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 launched with 3 astronauts aboard. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders would become the first humans to leave Earth orbit, the first to see the entire Earth as a sphere floating in space, the first to orbit another world. On Christmas Eve 1968, as Apollo 8 circled the Moon, the crew read from the Book of Genesis while television cameras showed the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. It was one of the most watched broadcasts in history, seen by an estimated 500 million people worldwide. The iconic Earthrise photograph taken by Bill Anders during that mission became one of the most important images of the 20th century. It showed Earth as a fragile blue marble against the darkness of space, vulnerable and precious. Environmental activists would later credit that image with launching the modern environmental movement. Seeing Earth from the Moon changed how humanity thought about our planet and our place in the universe, and it was made possible by technology developed by men who had once built weapons for the Nazis. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 conducted a full dress rehearsal, flying to the Moon and descending to within 9 miles of the surface before returning. Every system was tested, every procedure was practiced. Von Braun's methodical approach meant that by the time Apollo 11 launched, NASA had extraordinary confidence in the hardware and procedures. On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins climbed into their Apollo spacecraft atop the Saturn V. Von Braun watched from the Launch Control Center as the final countdown proceeded. At 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, the 5 F1 engines ignited. Flames erupted from the base of the rocket. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that pounded the chests of spectators miles away. Hold-down arms released, and the Saturn V began to rise. Slowly at first, almost ponderously, then with increasing speed. The rocket cleared the launch tower, rolled to its proper heading, and accelerated towards space. From his console in Huntsville, Von Braun monitored telemetry as his rocket performed exactly as designed. 2.5 minutes into flight, the first stage shut down and separated. The second stage ignited, pushing the spacecraft faster and higher. 9 minutes after launch, the third stage fired to complete orbital insertion. Everything was perfect. Later that day, the third stage reignited, pushing Apollo 11 out of Earth orbit toward the Moon. Translunar injection. The journey that would end with human footprints on another world had begun. 4 days later, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong guided the lunar module Eagle to a landing in the Sea of Tranquility. His famous words, transmitted across 250,000 miles of space, were heard around the world. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. 20 minutes later, Buzz Aldrin joined him on the surface. They spent 2.5 hours outside the spacecraft collecting samples, taking photographs, setting up experiments. Then they returned to the lunar module, blasted off from the Moon, rendezvoused with Michael Collins in lunar orbit, and began the journey home. On July 24, 1969, the Apollo 11 command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. President Nixon, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, welcomed the astronauts home. The mission had succeeded. America had won the space race, and Wernher von Braun had achieved his lifelong dream. Technology he had helped develop had taken humans to another world. 5 more Apollo missions would successfully land on the Moon. Apollo 13 suffered an oxygen tank explosion that nearly killed the crew, but they made it home safely in what was called a successful failure. Apollo 17 in December 1972 was the last lunar landing. 12 human beings had walked on the Moon, all carried there by Saturn V rockets, all returning safely to Earth. It remains humanity's greatest exploration achievement. Von Braun continued to advocate for an ambitious space program. He proposed a space station, reusable spacecraft, and a manned mission to Mars. But public interest in space exploration faded after the Moon landings. Budgets were cut, programs were cancelled. In 1972, von Braun left NASA to work for Fairchild Industries, becoming a vice president for engineering and development. He spent his final years promoting space exploration to anyone who would listen, but the momentum was gone. He died of pancreatic cancer on June 16, 1977, at age 65. His obituaries celebrated him as the father of space exploration, the man who made the Moon landings possible. Some mentioned his German background. Few discussed his Nazi connections in detail. The narrative of von Braun as a peaceful scientist who had been forced to build weapons had become accepted truth. It would be years before historians and journalists fully documented his actual role in the Third Reich, his knowing use of slave labour, his SS membership, his participation in Nazi atrocities. The other Operation Paperclip scientists continued their work in America with varying degrees of success and controversy. Some made genuine contributions to American science and became respected members of their communities. Others struggled with alcoholism, depression or alienation, never fully adjusting to their new homeland. A few maintained contact with neo-Nazi organizations, providing American intelligence with troubling evidence of ongoing extremist sympathies. Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's deputy and a key figure in Saturn V development, received NASA's highest honor in 1969 for his work on the Apollo program. But in 1984, the Office of Special Investigations began investigating his wartime activities. Evidence showed he had been directly responsible for working conditions at Mittelwerk, where prisoners were systematically worked to death. Rudolph agreed to renounce his US citizenship and leave the country rather than face prosecution. He returned to Germany, where he died in 1996, still claiming he had done nothing wrong. The Rudolph case opened a broader re-examination of Operation Paperclip. Investigative journalists discovered that dozens of scientists brought to America had been more deeply involved in Nazi war crimes than their sanitized files indicated. The Justice Department opened investigations into several cases, though most of the scientists were elderly or already dead. The program that had been celebrated as a triumph of American pragmatism was now being recognized as a moral compromise with disturbing implications. The Soviet Union had conducted its own operation to capture German rocket scientists and technology. They had taken control of the Peenemünde facilities and other research centers. They had forcibly relocated hundreds of German engineers and technicians to the Soviet Union. But they never achieved the same integration of German and Soviet personnel that characterized the American effort. Soviet chief designer Sergei Korolev, deeply suspicious of the Germans, kept them isolated from sensitive programs. By the mid-1950s, most German scientists in the Soviet Union had been sent back to East Germany. The Soviets developed their space program largely independently, using German technology as a starting point, but not German personnel as the core of their effort. This difference helps explain why America eventually won the space race, despite early Soviet successes. The Soviets had brilliant designers like Korolev and talented engineers, but they never fully exploited the knowledge that Germany had developed. America, by contrast, had integrated von Braun's team completely into the space program, combining German systematic engineering with American industrial capacity and innovation. The result was a space program that, while slower to start, eventually achieved more ambitious goals more reliably. The legacy of Operation Paperclip extends far beyond the space program. The German scientists brought expertise in jet propulsion, aerodynamics, guidance systems, material science, and countless other fields. American universities hired German scientists as professors. Defense contractors employed German engineers. Research laboratories welcomed German expertise. The influence spread throughout American science and technology, impossible to fully trace or quantify. In aerospace engineering, certain design philosophies and approaches can be traced directly to German influence. The emphasis on systematic testing and documentation, the use of mathematical modelling before hardware development, the organisation of large engineering teams into specialised divisions. These became standard practice in American aerospace largely because German scientists had brought these methods with them and trained a generation of American engineers. The program also raised questions about scientific ethics that remain relevant today. Can scientists claim to be politically neutral while working on weapons for oppressive regimes? Do researchers bear moral responsibility for how their work is used? Should scientific achievement excuse moral compromise? Operation Paperclip answered these questions pragmatically, not philosophically. The scientists were useful, therefore they were recruited. Their crimes were inconvenient, therefore they were concealed. American national security was paramount, therefore moral concerns were secondary. This utilitarian approach succeeded in its immediate objectives, but left unresolved ethical problems that continue to haunt discussions of science and morality. When modern engineers work on military systems or weapons development, they wrestle with questions that Operation Paperclip never adequately addressed. What are the moral limits of scientific work? When should researchers refuse to apply their knowledge? How do we balance technological progress against ethical concerns? The program also demonstrated the power of public relations and narrative control. Von Braun's transformation from SS officer building vengeance weapons with slave labor to beloved American space hero was deliberate and carefully managed. It showed how institutional support, media access, and consistent messaging could reshape public perception completely. The truth about von Braun's Nazi past was never secret. It was published in newspapers and magazines. But the preferred narrative of the brilliant scientist trapped by circumstances who had always dreamed of peaceful space exploration was promoted so consistently and effectively that it became accepted truth for millions of Americans. Only decades later, after von Braun's death, when historians gained access to classified documents and conducted detailed research, did a more complete and troubling picture emerge. By then, the space program had been successful, the Cold War had been won, and von Braun had become a historical figure whose legacy was more important than his actual history. The question of what to do with Operation Paperclip's legacy remains unresolved. Should von Braun be remembered primarily as a Nazi collaborator who used slave labor, or as the visionary engineer who made space exploration possible? The answer, uncomfortably, is both. Human history is filled with similar moral complexities. Great achievements often come from compromised circumstances. The infrastructure of the modern world was built by people who committed or tolerated terrible things. Scientific. Advances have been made by researchers with questionable ethics. Technological progress has come at costs we'd prefer not to examine too closely. Operation Paperclip exemplifies this pattern in an unusually stark and well-documented way. We can measure both the costs and the benefits with unusual precision. The costs were moral. Justice denied to concentration camp victims whose labour built the V2. Truth concealed from the American public about who these scientists were and what they had done. A message sent that technical expertise excuses collaboration with genocide. The benefits were strategic and scientific. Missile technology that helped America compete in the Cold War. Space capabilities that culminated in the moon landings. Knowledge that accelerated American scientific development across multiple fields. When we look at the Saturn V standing in museums today, when we see footage of Apollo astronauts bounding across the lunar surface, when we study the engineering achievements that made those missions possible, we are seeing the legacy of Operation Paperclip, both the triumphs and the compromises that made those triumphs possible. There is no way to separate them cleanly, to accept the benefits while rejecting the costs, to celebrate the achievements while condemning the methods that created them. The final assessment of Operation Paperclip depends on what we value most. If we prioritize American strategic success in the Cold War and humanity's expansion into space, the program was an unqualified triumph that achieved its objectives beyond anyone's expectations. If we prioritize justice for Nazi crimes and honesty about moral compromises, the program was a failure that allowed war criminals to escape accountability and built American achievement on a foundation of concealed atrocities. Most likely, the truth lies in holding both perspectives simultaneously. Acknowledging that Operation Paperclip succeeded brilliantly at its stated objectives, while also recognizing that those objectives required moral compromises we should be deeply uncomfortable with. Understanding that the technology that took us to the moon came from men who had used slave labor to build terror weapons. Accepting that human progress is complicated, that history is messy, that there are no simple heroes or villains, only people making difficult choices in circumstances we can barely imagine. The German scientists who came to America through Operation Paperclip were not monsters. They were brilliant engineers who had made terrible choices, talented researchers who had collaborated with evil, visionary thinkers who had built weapons of mass destruction. They were human beings with all the moral complexity that entails, and America, in recruiting them, protecting them, and building a space program around them, made its own complex moral choice, a choice that succeeded in its objectives and haunts us still. That is the true legacy of Operation Paperclip, not a simple story of American triumph or moral failure, but a complicated truth about what nations will do to gain advantage, what scientists will rationalize to continue their work, and what future generations inherit from the compromises of the past.